Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world. So much love to each and every one of you. I can't tell you how incredibly moving some of your comments are. Thank you so much. I really appreciate them. It's so inspirational for me to hear from you. And I love knowing all about you because I love to know who my audience is. And I think I'm very privileged because I've got amazing people tuning in to me. So thanks for that. And before we get started, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so. Click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And you know the rules. Go and get that fabulous drink. And if I don't know about it, I'd like to know. So let's get started with tonight's story.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Hector, and although I'm a bona fide American, I was actually born in England and grew up in the 80s era. My father was temporarily posted to London for a brief assignment that ended up lasting 12 long years. So invariably the first 10 years of my life was spent in England, until my parents finally returned home to North America, which was where I had my Bigfoot encounter at the young age of 18. I grew up in the English countryside in a quaint English Berkshire village, which was about 10 miles from Windsor, 35 miles from London, 4 miles from Wokingham, and 7 miles from Henley-on-Thames. I grew up in a Grade 2 listed property on over an acre of land, and the picturesque farmhouse was exceedingly old, but had been restored to its original pristine condition. The house itself was very wholesome, with a whimsical fairy tale charm, and was considered an architecture's treasure. It was built from stone, red brick, stucco and wood, and was surrounded by emerald green pristinely manicured lawns, beds of exquisite rambling roses, hollyhocks, larkspur, daisies, beautiful blue delphiniums, and deep red hardy geraniums. There was a scattering of tall tarry oaks, and on one side of the property was an orchard of apple trees. The inside of our home was very sumptuous and cosy, with oak timber floors and beautiful doors with timber beam accents, both on ceilings and walls. There was a grand ornate oak staircase that led to the upper floors of our home, and then there was a huge stone fireplace in virtually every room of the entire house. I had an idyllic childhood playing with the village kids and attending the local school there, while my father commuted to London every day, which was an hour each way from Wokingham to London Waterloo. I remember when I was about 7 or 8 years old, I became very aware that we were not alone in our home, and that was when my first introduction to the paranormal was born. Every night I would hear these airy footsteps quickly pacing up and down our wooden floors at night, and rushing up and down the staircase very quickly in a hurried way, almost as if someone was in a frantic rush. As a kid, it was absolutely terrifying for me to hear these spooky, anomalous sounds, and when I began to tell my mother that someone was walking around our home at night, she assured me that old houses were notorious for making strange noises. I was not convinced, because I knew I was hearing very distinct footsteps walking up and down those creaky floorboards. One night I looked up from my bed, as I thought my mother had entered my bedroom. I witnessed my door handle twisting spookishly, until finally the door creaked open, making an ominous squeaky sound that scared the living daylights out of me. "Mum, is that you?" I called out uneasily from my bed, but there was no answer. I remember staring at the door and feeling certain that someone invisible or a spectral figure was there watching me. I could sense those ethereal eyes gazing at me. For a while all was very still and quiet, and I could hear the sound of heavy feet walking suddenly across my room to the very side of my bed, where the footsteps suddenly just stopped. I remember I sat there, frozen to the spot, with my hair standing on end, as I felt a very formidable, somewhat menacing presence standing close by my bed, staring at me. Yet I saw absolutely nothing. The air in my room became very icy and cold, and I began to shiver violently. "Who's there?" I called out. "Who's there? Who is there?" But there was no answer, and my voice seemed to echo back to me. After a while the hair-raising footsteps retreated and finally left my bedroom. I watched in horror as my door was quickly closed behind me. Terrified, I ran to my parents' bedroom, crying hysterically. I assured them that someone outer-worldly had entered my bedroom and had been standing over my bed watching me. My parents assured me it was my childlike imagination, and children were very good at creating scary pictures in their heads. I did not believe that for a moment. One night I was awoken up to someone shaking me very hard. At first I thought it was my mother waking me up for school, and I groaned, looking at her through my sleepy eyelids. But it was not my mother that I was observing, but someone else, whom I can only describe as a young woman dressed in 1800s clothes, who looked like a maidservant. "Sir, you must come now," came the disquieted voice. "Your son has fallen off his horse, and he's in a very bad way, sir. I think he may be dead. Come at once." I sat up in alarm as I looked at the earnest face of this young woman, who faded before my eyes and suddenly vanished. For some reason I was not afraid, but more mystified by this evocative, rather gripping experience. Even at such a young age, I was consumed and enthralled by that experience. The event seemed so surreal to me, but I was certain I had seen this ethereal, ghost-like girl, and when I told my mother about what had happened to me, I was surprised that she actually believed me. "I have seen that servant girl too," she told me, "running across our lawn in the middle of the night, looking frantic. I knew she was a ghost because she faded before my very eyes. It was the most spellbinding, transfixing thing that I've ever witnessed," she told me. Finally, I had my mother on board with me because she had been seeing some curious, unexplained phenomena in our home as well, which meant she was less likely to dismiss me again should I have another supernatural encounter. So as irrational as it sounds, instead of feeling fearful about the strange, unearthly, abnormal events going on in our home, it would seem that my mother and I developed a startling passion and somewhat extraordinary intrigue and fascination for all things outlandish, outer-worldly and paranormal. Before long, my mother began to investigate the history of our home. We were to discover a newspaper article which read the following concerning the previous residents of our home, going back many generations. "Mr. Bryce Lockwood was horse-riding with his brother George down a Berkshire country lane when George described seeing something so freakish that defies all natural explanation. It was a diabolical monster," he told the papers, "standing upright on 2 legs, and it was about 7 foot tall and 3 feet wide, covered in dense, thick black hair. It had a hideously evil, grotesque-looking face, like that of a wolf or a savage dog, and it had very long, full tail, like that of a red fox. My brother and I stared at this demonical creature in utter horror, and it curled back its hideous mouth to expose its very sharp canine teeth, and it growled so viciously at us that the menacing, fiendish sound actually caused the ground beneath us to vibrate. I have never heard such a chilling, abhorrent sound like that before or since," he explained to the paper. "It sent the fear of God into every fibre of my being. This creature looked like he had surfaced from the fire pit of hell itself, if there is indeed such a place." Upon seeing the creature, the horses bolted in terror, with the creature pursuing us from behind. My brother Bryce's terrified horse literally dashed under a tree, where the lower branches thrashed him off the horse so forcefully that he was plunged to the ground and killed on impact. On returning to the scene, it was discovered that Mr. Bryce's clothes had been shredded off his dead corpse by a very savage wild animal, and there were peculiar deep scratches embedded in his torso that the mortician described as coming from the claws of a very large animal of disproportionate size. These were different to the scratch marks received before death from the tree branches, she explained to the papers. "I've never seen anything like them before. The claws that caused these scratch marks were quite literally like daggers." Could there be any truth to this very strange story, or was Mr. George Lockwood intoxicated from a little too much sherry at the time? Yet, if that were the case, what caused the mysterious scratch marks on Mr. Bryce Lockwood's corpse that has left the mortician, Dr. Powell, baffled and at a loss for words? If Mr. George Bryce's allegations do indeed have merit, is there really a wild beast roaming the Derbyshire countryside that would seem to be not of this world? "Wow," I said to my mother, "I now know why that maidservant was shaking me in the night to wake me up. She thought I was Mr. Bryce Lockwood's father and was waking me up to tell me about the horse-riding accident when George was flung to his death." "That would explain why I saw the servant girl running frantically across the lawn," said my mother. "She was trying to get help after Mr. Bryce's dreadful horse-riding accident. Poor thing. I think we may have been caught up in some kind of a time glitch where the memory of a traumatic event is played back in our time. I've heard about that sort of thing happening before. It would seem that my mother and I began to become incredibly fascinated by the paranormal, and my mother would leave a recorder on in the house overnight, and the next morning we would pick up strange messages like, "Bryce is dead," "It was a monster," or "The horse bolted." Everything that we picked up on our recordings seemed to correlate back to the dreadful accident that killed poor Bryce Lockwood. Finally, it would seem when I was 10 years old, my parents returned home to North America, back to Seattle, where they're initially from, and we settled down to life in the city in a stunningly refurbished modernised apartment that overlooked fabulous views of the city and the Space Needle. I attended a local school there, and I began to really enjoy my new life in North America, acquiring many new friends, as well as an American accent. Before long, my interest in the paranormal seemed to wane and dissipate, as I got caught up in the drudgery of everyday routines, such as after-school football practice and drama lessons. One day I began to hear creepy stories of a ghostly apparition that was seen by 3 different eyewitnesses in a forest in the Washington area, and when I told my mother about the sightings, our intrigue and bubbling passion for the paranormal was reborn. "Let's go to that forest at once," my mother enthused excitedly. "We can camp out there overnight. It'll be fun. And while we're in the area, we can interview some of the eyewitnesses and ask them exactly what they saw." I thought it was a fabulous idea, but my father scoffed at us and told us that our obsessive interest and exuberant enthusiasm for all things unseen bordered on the insane, and we were off our heads to want to go chasing after ghosts. Fast forward to a week or so, my mother and I had spoken to 3 different eyewitnesses who had spotted the apparition of a young woman seen in her nightgown rushing through the woods, but no one knew anything about her, or who she was, or how she died. Yet everyone gave a very poignant, similar account of the sighting that made the eyewitness reports seem very credible. She had long blonde, loose-flowing hair, we were told, fair skin, and wore a long nightgown, and she ran like the wind through the forest. It would seem that something or someone appeared to be terrorising her, as she kept looking behind her as if she was being chased. The expression on her face was one of utter terror. I'll never forget her petrified look. "Did she see you?" I remember asking. "No, she just ran, but I knew she was a ghost because she ran through a solid tree, and then she vanished." It was on a Saturday night when my mother and I hitched our tents up in an open clearing beside a silvery lake on the edge of these dreamy woods, consisting of mature, tall, imposing western hemlocks, Douglas firs, spruce, red alder and Pacific yew trees. It was a very exquisite location, and I knew that whether my mother or I witnessed the apparition of the young girl or not, at the very least we were in for having a very good time. "Your dad thinks we're both completely potty," my mother giggled, as we barbecued some steaks over the open grill and fire pit. "He says if we hadn't lived in that old house back in England, we wouldn't have become so obsessed by the paranormal." "He's probably right," I admitted. "I mean, after you've seen something like that you can't explain, it does have a way of arousing your curiosity and interest." "You can say that again," said my mother, looking excited. "Oh, I do so hope we see that spooky girl tonight. I wonder what on earth she's running from." "So do I said. "Oh, look," I said, pointing to the distance. "Look over there," I said excitedly. "There's some white-tailed deer over there, gathering at the water's edge to drink. They're so gentle and serene." "They most certainly are," sighed my mother happily. "It's so lovely out here. We should camp more often." That night we set our alarm clocks for about 12 p.m, because all 3 eyewitnesses claimed to have seen the apparition of the young girl in the forest at about 20 past 12. My mother and I retired to our sleeping bags and fell fast asleep, to the distant howls of coyotes, the chorus of crickets, frogs, and the occasional owl hoot. We were awoken to the sound of our buzzing alarm clocks, going off at about 12 o'clock. My mother woke me up eagerly. "Get up," she said. "We want to make sure we see the ghost of the girl, remember?" My mother was physically so excited that I had to literally calm her down. I think Mother was more of a kid than I was, because she was so flustered and enthusiastic about our nightly excursion of ghost hunting. "Mum, I don't want you to be disappointed if we don't see the ghost," I told her. "You can never guarantee these things." "I know, dear, but it's still so exciting looking for her in the dead of night like this." We put on our headlamps and, armed with our flashlights, a camera and a tape recorder, we ventured into the woods. "Whereabouts do you think the girl was last seen?" my mother asked. Suddenly we could both smell the most hideous odour that you could ever imagine, and it was so vile and repugnant and smelt like seriously off meat or rotten eggs and was burning our eyes and causing us to sneeze.
"What the hell is that?" whispered my mother, searching the woods with my spotlight and flashing my torch around to see if I could observe a dead animal, but I could see nothing there. "Something is watching us," whispered my mother. "Look over there." My mother was pointing towards a tree branch that was moving backwards and forwards, and I could swear I could see a black shadowy form lurking behind the tree. "I think it's a shadow person," I whispered to my mother, "and it seems to be interacting with us." My mother became animated because it would seem we had discovered another ghostly apparition in the woods, and she was absolutely enthused. "Supposing it's the man that was chasing after the ghostly girl," she suggested. "Let's follow it," she urged excitedly.
As we moved towards the swaying trees, we suddenly heard the most terrible guttural growl, which was unlike anything I've heard before, and it sent shivers down my spine. I've never felt that afraid before. "It's a demon," whispered my mother in horror. "Let's get away from it. In all my research on ghostly apparitions, a ghost that growls is definitely demonic." As we moved away from the growling demonical being, suddenly we heard the most dreadful sound, like a massive animal charging through the bush, tearing towards us at a thunderous speed, and as it moved, it caused the ground beneath it to shake and vibrate. My mother and I started to run as fast as we could in the opposite direction from our tent, and we stopped for a moment to see if we could see the demonic entity that we thought was chasing us, but what we saw was so strange. For that moment we just stood paralysed and frozen to the spot, like vast blocks of ice, immobilised by terror. Standing over 100 yards away from us was the hugest monstrous creature that I've ever seen. I mean, this thing was jumbo in size. It must have easily been 10 foot tall, possibly more, and at the very least 1,000 pounds, and approximately 5 foot wide. Forget these measurements. This thing was hectically huge and powerfully intimidating, and it possessed a very hostile demeanour towards us. It glared and glowered at us with such an intense hatred, loathing and revulsion, a look that I could see emanated fiercely from its aggressive, hostile red eyes. I could tell that it was covered in coal-black long hair, and it was built like an army tank. It was that burly. I noticed that every area of this critter's body literally bulged with muscle that would have intimidated the strongest man in the world, I promise you. My mother and I afterwards were pretty sure that this thing could have easily lifted up a car in its bare hands, as if it was just a toy. There are no words to describe to you the strength, power, and might of this extraordinary creature. I observed that this beast possessed these humongous-sized shoulders, the likes of such I've never ever seen before, and very overlong arms, and powerfully strong, sturdy legs, and a very distinctive cone-shaped head. I could not believe what I was actually seeing. The creature growled at us and rolled back its mouth to reveal very large, jagged, human-like teeth that glistened menacingly under the light of our headlamps, and then it began to make the most gut-wrenching roar that would easily make a lion's roar almost seem like a pussy-cat, and I'm not exaggerating. Even the tree shook under the vibration of this monstrous beast, and especially when it made that raucous, ungodly sound. My mother screamed at the top of her lungs as this thing came charging towards us. He grabbed my mother viciously and threw her to the ground like a baseball, but she got up and tore through the woods as fast as she could, and the creature was running fast behind us. I have never ever encountered such hostility and aggression before, but this creature, if he'd wanted to kill us, he could have done so in a heartbeat. I think he just wanted us off his turf, but let me tell you, I've never encountered such aggression before. Once we'd run through the forest, there was an open road and a farmhouse in the distance, so we ran over there and banged on the front door as hard as we could. We told the kindly farmer that something had chased us through the woods, and we were so terrified and too frightened to go back to our camping spot. We did not want to tell him about the ape-like humanoid in case he thought we were a couple of nutters, but we knew what we saw that night. "You are not the first to be chased out of those woods," said the farmer. "Believe me, I've heard some stories about those woods." He assured us that we were welcome to stay at their home overnight. The next morning he was good enough to accompany us back to our camping site, armed with his hunting rifle for our protection, so that we could gather all our belongings to go home. Imagine our immense surprise when we observed that all our things were scattered absolutely everywhere, all over the clearing, and our tent had been torn to shreds. I remember the farmer was so dumbfounded. He said to us, "Remind me to never hunt in these woods. What the hell did this to your tent?" He was absolutely horrified. Many, many years later, my mother and I learnt about the strange beast that we encountered in the woods was in fact a Bigfoot, and this creature put an end to our ghost hunting expeditions altogether because it frightened the living daylights out of us and put us off ghost hunting for good. My mother believes that the ghostly apparition in the woods may have actually been running away from this horrible monster, but we don't know how long ago she was killed, but it's a very likely scenario or possibility. Anyway, that's my story. I just want to say thank you so much for that incredible story. My word, wow, incredible. Until next time, goodbye and good night.